The Mission, Chapter 3. Today is an apex moment in the history of Bristol's clockmaking industry. The titans of timekeeping are all assembled in one place, Foster's Tavern, the hotspot for all of Bristol's social and business dealings. It's not the place for secrecy. Quite the opposite. It's a place to be seen, for showmanship, and that's the order of the day. In broad daylight, Bristol's streets hold witness to what can be described as a royal parade of carriages, delivering the upper echelon of clockmakers to a large conference room inside Foster's Tavern. In attendance are more than a dozen of Bristol's top-tier businessmen, seated in groups around 4 round tables. The first table features the legacy manufacturers, whose families had grown their small clock shops into massive factories of clock production. Here we find none other than Theodore Terry, who Nathan previously met at the Barnes House porch. Theodore's firm, Terry and Andrews, is recognized as Bristol's #1 clockmaker by output metrics. The second table seats the new industrialists, men who combined smart investments, diligent management, and slick marketing to carve out their own slice of the global clock market. Here we find the prominent success stories of John Birge and Brewster and Ingram, and a seat for Nathan, who today represents his father's interests at the meeting. In one corner table sits the Forestville contingent, J.C. Brown, Manross, and Hendrick, all clockmakers who avoided the crowded downtown riverfront and instead tapped the water power of the upstream Pequabic River, thereby carving out a separate industrial center that came to be known as Forestville. Here we find Captain Elisha Manross, the father of Nathan's friend Newton. Finally, in the back row are the captains of the supply business, who make their money by offering the specialty parts and back shop supply chain of clock production. First among them is Edward Dunbar, nephew of Silas Hoadley, and keeper of Eli Terry's proprietary metallurgic secrets for creating durable metal components of a clock movement. Dunbar offers springs, trims, verges, and other integral hardware needed by the clockmakers. Last in the room is Eliza Welsh, who offers the weights and bells that form the beating heart of a clock, parts that can only be forged from the rocks and raw materials in the dark and sweltering workspaces of his iron foundry. Yet all these clockmakers and suppliers, well secured in their business successes and profitable futures, have no sense of the fragility of it all. In a few short years, their world will be embroiled in war and panic. Half of these men will be bankrupt, some penniless, others dead, another a mysterious suicide, and one, only one, will triumph to become the richest man in Bristol, a veritable new king of the clockmakers. Because unbeknownst to those now sitting in this room at Foster's Tavern, there is one among them whose malicious intentions and diabolic actions will destroy the fortunes of all the others. He will trick and sabotage his competition until he alone stands at the top of Bristol's clockmaking industry, revealing the identity of and stopping this Judas among the clockmakers will be Nathan's most urgent mission. Yet at this moment, all Nathan can do is observe the room, the posturing, the exuberance, the confident smiles of each of the men in the room. Here, at Foster's Tavern, are Bristol's finest clockmakers, united in the pursuit of profit, of greater scales of production, of that biblical ethos to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. But right now, the hour is commanded by somebody not from Bristol, but from the adjacent town of Waterbury. A rural village known only as a stagecoach stop, Waterbury created a new destiny for itself as a hub for the production of a most precious resource, a raw material that was especially valuable to clockmakers, brass. One future day, Waterbury would earn the nickname Brass City, and it would have one man to thank for it, Israel Holmes. So now Holmes of Waterbury stands up and delivers his sales pitch to the clockmakers of Bristol. Gentlemen, there's one thing, powerful thing, that has shaken the foundations of your businesses, forced you to adapt, to evolve, to profit more than ever before. And that thing is brass. Brass gears. Brass movements, brass clocks. No longer must you import 100 varieties of rare woods, for all of it to sit there in your woodsheds, seasoning for a year or more, then to carve and saw them all into clocks, only to face the criticism of uneducated buyers, who, we all know, thanks to those fraudsters and hucksters in New York, have been taught to favor the shiny turning of a faulty metal clock instead of appreciating the wooden masterpieces that you have created for a generation and are now classed with the likes of cheap trinkets and wooden chestnuts. Now, in a few short moments, a handful of workers can stamp out all the gears of a dozen clock movements from a single sheet of rolled brass, saving time, cutting costs, and delivering big profits. Brass, gentlemen, brass. To those who can't adapt, I wish you a kind farewell. To those who can't compete, I wish you many restful days with your grandchildren on your laps. But to those who have the vision, the intelligence to seize this moment, to bring the production of brass to Bristol, I offer you a method to do so. A fellowship of clockmakers brought together today to pledge, each of you, a wise wager, a modest sum of capital, to create and be shareholders of the Bristol Brass and Clock Company. To those who say it can't be done, I offer you my example. In Waterbury, they call me a businessman, an investor, a humble and God-fearing member of the congregation. But in England, they call me a crook, a thief, a smuggler. It is true that for all these years, England has held an unbreakable iron fist monopoly on brass production. It has banned all export of its workmen, machines, and knowledge of the brass production process, so that these English companies could gouge us with exorbitant prices for imported brass, and there was little that we here in Bristol or Waterbury could do about it. It is also true that I traveled myself to England. Not steal, no, but to borrow a few brass machines, die-cast parts, and apprentices to bring over to America. I admit I'm guilty of a few errors on my customs paperwork. I may have forgotten to fill out a few lines on the export form identifying the type of brass-making machines I was exporting. They also blame me for encouraging those Scottish casters and rollers, all expert workers in the trade of brass making, to sit inside of wine barrels instead of their seats on the ship until the customs agent finished his rounds and their ship set sail for America. These omissions are not crimes, gentlemen. They are natural acts of a free and fair market, the kind our forefathers fought so hard to create for us. And so I borrowed a few seeds of knowledge from England, planted those seeds in Waterbury with labor and diligence, and now we feast upon a vast and valuable harvest of brass there today. We can do the same right here in Bristol, but without the pains of having to sail all the way to England, because I offer those seeds to you now, not for free, but for a discount, for a partnership. So who's with me? Applause. The majority are swayed. Contracts are drawn up, and Bristol's titans of clockmaking ink their names onto the papers. A coalition dedicated to making Bristol the new hub of brass production. As the clockmakers rush towards the door to get back to their factories, Peck and Nathan retreat to a secluded space in the rear of the tavern for a private conversation. So, Inspector Birge, what do you think? Well, Mr. Peck, we need a plan, obviously. But really, we'll need more than that to build a justifiable case that will withstand public scrutiny. What we need is resources that I can leverage to recruit, to persuade, to get the job done, just like when I ran my trading team on the frontier. So my question to you, Mr. Peck, is, what am I working with? Well, Nathan, you'll need some money, of course. We can't rely on private investors since we can't trust anyone outside of you, me, and Mr. Barnes. And Bristol doesn't have any banks to borrow from. However, I am a founding member of the Bristol Building and Loan Association. It's the town's only official financial institution of sorts. We can secure you a loan from the association, set up an account under a business name to hide the money. Great idea, Mr. Peck. Well, Nathan, when you say it like that, it sounds a bit... Never mind the perception. It's about the plan. Here's what I'm thinking, Mr. Peck. First, we need to win their trust. Since we don't know who is with us or against us, let's make a public action to show everyone that the Birge family is no threat to them. It's clear that all these clockmakers want this brass company to succeed and make them rich. So let my father's company be the first to place a large order for brass. I want the Birge, Peck & Company to be the first client of this new Bristol Brass and Clock Company. Second, Mr. Peck, I'll need a cover business. Something in manufacturing. Something that keeps me at the table for all manner of business dealings. So I can observe firsthand what is happening behind the scenes, to rustle up and suss out the right evidence to build my case. It should be a small enterprise, not too big to attract attention from the clockmakers, and also set aside from the others for privacy. Well, Nathan, there's a small property for sale over by the pond next to the Hoppers hilltops. There's water power and a structure we could refit. Perfect. Any idea what kind of business, Nathan? Well, it would have to be a profitable business, or we'll have to close it down before it even starts. I know just the thing, Mr. Peck. We'll make something valuable. Something everyone not only wants, but needs. Clocks, right, Nathan? Your father had the same sales pitch. No, not clocks, Mr. Peck. Underwear. Garments. The garment business. I've got some know-how of it from my fur trading days out west. We'll start a textile mill in that property by the pond as our cover business. A wild idea, Nathan, but a good one. Right, let's start as soon as possible. You make that offer on the property, and in the meantime, I'll start recruiting our first team of workers for the mill. Well, Nathan, if you need factory workers, there's plenty of job seekers downtown. We can advertise at the taverns. No, that's too high profile. I don't want to employ anyone who already has ties to the other businesses in town. It's too risky. We need fresh faces. I can train them to do the job. It's not the expertise that we need. What we're looking for here, Mr. Peck, is loyalty. Well, Nathan, then you'll need to hire from the immigrant labor pool, the new arrivals, the Irish. Where can I find them? At the Bristol copper mine, mostly. They call it Little Dublin now. Let's go. Well, you certainly don't waste any time, do you, Nathan? Well, Mr. Peck, whenever he was in a rush, my father used to say, clocks we have, time we don't. Nathan and Tracy mount their carriage and ride towards the northern edge of Bristol, towards the mine. Here, on the outskirts of town, is where Bristol's crowded urban landscape transforms into a series of scattered farmhouses, thick patches of forest, and then, out on the edges of town, the Bristol copper mine. This is where the Bristol Mining Company set up shop in hopes of finding a literal gold mine of precious geological reserves hidden beneath the unique geology of Bristol's terra firma. Here again, Nathan sees Bristol's systematic pursuit of profit, not above the ground in a busy factory, but below ground, extracting it from Bristol's subterranean world, finding treasure in the dirt under your feet. At this specific place on the crust of the Earth's surface, there exists an underground mountain of red Triassic sandstone from the Farrington River Valley, crushing itself against another subterranean crag of crystalline rocks composed from Connecticut's western upland. It is in this cocktail of time, heat, and friction that prehistoric mud is transformed into priceless gemstones and many other types of valuable rocks. This treasure chest of geology was first discovered by a farmer who accidentally stumbled upon a spring of green water streaming from the ground beside an old pathway used by the Tunxis tribesmen, who traveled along a set of hills later known as Zach's Mountain. The green water was a clue to the hidden riches underneath, copper ore, and lots of it. Bristol's mining operation sunk mine shafts hundreds of feet deep into the darkness of the earth, where the hard labor of Irish miners haul up thousands of pounds of copper ore. The mine also unearthed extraordinary crystals of chalcocite and bornite that were sent to museums across America and Europe, famous specimens given the Cornwall pedigree. As a result, professors from Yale University got involved. They came to the mine to make a study of all the curious new discoveries of all that was down there. But the mine managers had different priorities. Instead of studying the professors' special rocks, the mine managers pulverized them to bolster the mine's yield and profits. Because, at the end of the day, the mine was not a scientific operation. This mine was another scheme by the clockmakers to reduce their costs of production. Just like brass, copper ore had to be imported from England by boat and then hauled to Bristol by wagon. Finding enough copper ore right here in Bristol could tip the scales of business, cut the cost of production by half. This was the reason for the Bristol Brass and Clock Company. With a copper mine and a brass factory, Bristol could eliminate the high costs of importing rolled brass and achieve a rare accomplishment in business: supply chain independence and the ability to fix prices, elevating Bristol into a one-stop shop for clockmaking. But Nathan isn't worried about the nuances of price fixing. He is focused on the task at hand, hiring a trustworthy team for his new company. All right, Mr. Peck, let's make some friends. Where shall we begin, Nathan? Over there, I think. On the other end of the mine pit, behind a hill and tucked away from the hive of activity in the center, is a modest canvas tent. Unlike the fancy wooden offices of the mine management, this tent is a temporary and unofficial structure. Peck is hesitant. It looks a bit sketchy, right? But Nathan strolls right over and ducks inside the folds of the tent, where he finds quite a different scene. Not a storage tent, as you might expect from outside experiences, but a bar room. Dozens of tired-looking, mud-smeared miners squat on small wooden benches, clutching tin cups of full beer. On the far side of the tent is a small table behind which is a keg of beer, and also something else, a familiar face. Nathan comes and greets his friend. Hello again, Thomas. How are you and your 7 sons? Mr. Birge, oh gosh, what a sight. What are you doing here? On a business trip, stopping by to see the mining operations. Well then, welcome. Can I offer you a drink? No, thank you. Tell me, Thomas, I know you were looking for work. How did you find yourself here running a bar outside of a tent? Honest, Mr. Birge, we came here to work the mine. And the first thing we see is all these men working so hard and sweating for so many long hours. My Irish countryman next to me says, these men look tired, but it's a job, so he grabs a shovel and goes down to the mine. But me, I think to myself, these men look thirsty, so I set myself up here with this tent and seize the opportunity to offer a clean drink at a fair price. And the morale among the miners improves, and their productivity goes up so much that the mine management doesn't bother to shut me down. So here I am, making a business of it. Kudos, Thomas. That's the spirit. You'll do well here in Bristol with those kinds of business instincts. Listen, I'm starting up a small factory operation soon, and I need a few able hands to get it running. No experience required, but hardworking, trustworthy people. If you know a few, send them my way. Tell them to come looking for Nathan Birge at the pond next to that maze of hills that they call the Hoppers. Will do, sir. I surely will. And one more thing, Thomas. Tell your boys to keep their eyes and ears open around town. If they hear of any foul play, especially among the factory workers or their bosses, send me a message, quietly. And so begins the secret mission of Nathan Birge. To build his case, Nathan needs evidence, connections, clues. And all these things require careful attention and presence, being at the right place at the right moment to capture the evidence. Nathan is the only one working the case, so the work is slow. His best weapon is time. Days, weeks, months, and years pass in circles on the wheel of time as Nathan lives, works, and prospers. He builds up his textile mill into a successful company. He falls in love with Adeline, marries her, and starts a family. The intensity of Nathan's wanderlust fades, and he finally lets go of it, determined now to settle down in Bristol for the rest of his days. But in each of these days, Nathan never lets go of his secret mission. The Irish workers at his textile mill all lead double lives as Nathan's spies throughout Bristol, feeding him gossip and hearsay from the taverns, workshops, and loading docks. His textile business also offers a prime seat at Bristol's business roundtables, where Nathan studies the circular partnerships, loans, and financial leverages that propagate like spiderwebs underneath the public image of all these supposedly independent clockmakers. And then, one day, Nathan uncovers an ominous new clue. It's high noon, and Nathan is seated at the desk of his textile mill, hunched behind a stack of account books. In the corner lies a coat rack where Nathan's buffalo coat still hangs as a memento of his past adventures. There's a knock on the door. An unexpected visitor, Thomas, the Irishman, Thomas, please, come in, have a seat. What news? Hello, Mr. Birge. Please excuse the interruption. I brought something that might be of interest to you. Thomas withdraws a small, crumpled letter from his pocket and hands it to Nathan. What's this? Well, sir, I must admit I don't rightly know, as I've never been properly schooled in the letters and reading. But I do recognize one word written down here in this note, because the same letters are written big right there on the side of your factory. It's your name, Birge. Nathan inspects the letter. The outside envelope shows an addressee, but it's blurred from being soaked in water. Nathan can only make out the traces of a few letters, an E or maybe a C, and a W or possibly an I or an N. The rest is illegible. However, the contents of the envelope are still intact. It's a square, folded note which reads in precise ink handwriting, "Storm clouds coming to Birge Pond Mill." Thomas, where did you find this? Wasn't me, sir, but one of my live-ins named Mary. She does laundry for some of the families of the factory owners here in Bristol to earn a little bit of money on the side. As she was cleaning out the pockets of one of the coats, she found this letter with your name. I figured it might be of interest to you, so I brought it here and told her that if the owner of the coat ever asked about it, she was to say that it was destroyed in the bathwater. Thomas, do we know whose coat it belongs to? I asked her that. Mary said she didn't know the name of the man, but she saw him once wearing the coat and could describe him. Well, Thomas, let's follow the lead, my friend. Take me to Mary. Nathan was not a frequent visitor of the crowded housing blocks where most of Bristol's unskilled labor lived. Here is a reminder of the great chasm in the living conditions between the rich and poor, even in a profitable opportunity town like Bristol. Nathan finds Mary in a small shanty house with blocks of wood as the only furniture. She's huddled over a small fire where a few small potatoes are being boiled in a tin pot. This meager meal serving as the only dinner for herself and a few others crowded in the same room. Thomas invites her outside so she can speak with Nathan in private. Mary, hello. I'm Nathan Birge. Thank you for bringing this letter to Thomas and to me. Please, what can you tell me about it? Who does it belong to? As I told Thomas, I often do laundry for the families of the factory owners here. I don't know who the clothes belong to. I get them in buckets and turn them back clean and folded. Sometimes I find a few things left in the pockets before I wash them. I've seen the man who wears the coat where I found the note. I don't know his name or nothing, but I know I did see him one time at the mine, the copper mine, when I was picking up work there. At the Bristol copper mine? Yes, sir. In what capacity, Mary? Is he a manager there? No, sir. We all know the managers, and he wasn't one of them. Can you describe him? He's about your height, same age as you or Thomas, I imagine, with a beard and dressing proper, like one of the owners. And Mary, what brought him to the mine when you saw him? Do you know what he was discussing with the managers? I didn't rightly see everything, but I did see his attention focused on the specimens that were coming out of the mine tailings. He was inspecting the piles of rocks and was asking the managers about a serpent. He was asking about a snake? Yeah, or maybe I didn't hear it right. I was just passing him by, minding myself and my work, but I thought I heard him asking the managers for a serpent. What else can you remember, Mary? That's it, sir. I wish I could be more helpful. Thank you, Mary. This is helpful. Nathan pulls Thomas aside with new instructions. Thomas, spread the word. I believe this note is evidence of a secret network of communication, a way of coordinating activities through coded messages. And it's further concerning that this note foretells stormy weather to soon be headed for me or my mill. If anyone sees this man from the mine again, or finds any other notes written like this, you send for me right away. Aye, sir, will do. And in this way, Nathan kept his eyes open and everywhere, observing the happenings all around him in Bristol. Always trying to assess, to understand, if there was a connectedness between a random event and a darker plot. Always trying to uncover the edges of a conspiracy, or ringleader, or phenomenon that might be the true source of some unexplained chaos, a reason behind the destruction. Because chaos and destruction continued to afflict the clockmakers of Bristol. His father, John Birge, closed his firm and retired from clockmaking after 25 years due to serious financial difficulties. After being sued by his partner Joseph Ives, over-leveraged by his partners, and chased around the market by his competitors, an old, white-haired John Birge performed his final act. He paid off his debts, reclaimed his home that was put up as collateral, and retired back to the simple life of a farmer. His dream of inventing a new clock that could change the destiny of his community, a dream he once shared with Joseph Ives, was dead. And John Birge was the lucky one. Brewster, Platt, Atkins, Smith, Goodrich, all successful clock companies, all no more. The clock business of Elisha Manross went bankrupt when a new financial panic struck the clock market. Manross took on heavy mortgages, ran out of credit, and thus he ran out of time. Then, a devastating fire struck J.C. Brown's factory, weakening his production lines to the point where he too was forced out of the business, foreclosing his factories and auctioning all his shares to pay his debts. The demise of Chauncey Boardman became a well-known cautionary tale in the Bristol business community. Let's remember that Boardman was one of the few clock apprentices left alive in Bristol, one of the last of the first generation of clockmakers who learned not only to replicate, but to understand the intricate design of the internal clock movement and its ancient timekeeping algorithms. None of this knowledge or history mattered in the end, because Boardman made the mistake of allying his business interests with New York instead of Bristol. As the story goes, New York merchants started retailing Bristol clocks at wholesale prices, thereby creating a bargain market that hurt the profits of the Bristol clockmakers. To fight back, a majority of the Bristol clockmakers formed the Connecticut Protective Clock Co. as a cartel to ban the sale of Bristol clocks to these despicable free market New Yorkers. Boardman refused to join the cartel because New York was his primary market. He had failed to diversify, and he needed to sell to New York for his business to survive. But disloyalty to Bristol was unacceptable, so the cartel forced Boardman to sell his company or get thrown out of town. The cartel bought up Boardman's properties and holdings at fire sale prices, and then split everything up among 6 other clockmakers to ensure that no one could resurrect his business. And that was the end of the clock shop of Chauncey Boardman. The story of Terry and Andrews, Bristol's largest clockmaking operation since the Jerome Fire, was another tragic tale. Theodore Terry was coerced by an outside investor to move his clockmaking operations to another town, Ansonia, where this investor was running a rival brass mill. Chasing the prospect of a better deal, Theodore Terry made the consequential decision to sell his shares of the Bristol Brass and Clock Company and moved his capital and productions outside of Bristol to Ansonia. Chaos followed him. As soon as he arrived, his clock shop was destroyed by fire. Unwilling to return to Bristol, Theodore salvaged whatever he could from his charred clock shop and moved it to Bridgeport at the invitation of another new investor, the infamous showman, or should we call him con man, P.T. Barnum of the Ringling Brothers Circus fame. That's when Barnum concocted a plan to combine Theodore's losses from the Ansonia clock fire, along with other major debts that the showman had accumulated, into a new investment opportunity at a bargain price. And he knew just who to pitch it to. Down the road in New Haven lay the rising smokestacks of Chauncey Jerome's new clock company, an immense manufacturing enterprise that Jerome had built up brick by brick, clock by clock, after that disastrous fire had destroyed all 4 of his factories in Bristol. It was Jerome's phoenix from the ashes. Barnum waited until Jerome was out of town, and then he corralled Jerome's son, who was the secretary of Jerome's company, to buy majority shares of Barnum's overinflated, dysfunctional clock company in Bridgeport, along with a mountain of hidden debt. Jerome's son unknowingly agreed to this terrible investment, thereby enriching Barnum, but bankrupting Chauncey Jerome's entire business in New Haven. The iconic Chauncey Jerome, once king of clockmaking, a mayor of New Haven, lost all of his factories for the second time, in addition to his wealth and his status. And this time, Jerome lost everything. He left New Haven poor and penniless, unable to finance a new factory or a new destiny for himself. This was the end of the dream for Jerome. The loss of Jerome's company in New Haven sent tremors back to Bristol. Hendrick, a prominent clockmaker from Forestville and chief supplier to Jerome, became overwhelmed with debt. He lost every penny of his hard-won fortune and factories. He laid off all of his workers, and when creditors came to evict him and his family from their only home, it was too much for him to bear. He threw himself into the rushing waters of the Pequabic River, a death by suicide. All of these calamitous events were not necessarily connected. They could easily be categorized as the typical hazards of market economics. But Nathan knew something no one else knew. All along, Nathan was tracking the presence of a nefarious ringleader, a mastermind behind it all. And now, after all these years, he sends a message to his compatriot Tracy Peck. Nathan finally uncovered who lit the fire that burned down Chauncey Jerome's factories, and even more, who was responsible for the tempest of bankruptcies and disasters that had befallen Bristol's clockmakers. Peck instructs Nathan to meet him at midnight at his law office on Main Street, and it's here where Nathan finds him, seated in a leather chair next to a large window overlooking the dark, empty streets of Bristol's business district. Go ahead, Nathan. The floor is yours. Tell me what secrets you've uncovered. To be continued in the next chapter of The Mission.